The first light of dawn spilled softly across the airport runway, brushing everything it touched in a cold, muted glow. Inside the terminal, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Travelers moved in slow motion, jackets drawn tight, eyes half awake. Among them, near Gate 37, sat a man who barely seemed to register in the minds of those passing by. No entourage surrounded him. No expensive watch flashed under the fluorescent lights. He wore no tailored suit, no designer shoes. He was dressed simply, anonymously, like any other weary traveler making his way home. But he was anything but ordinary. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Yet here he was, alone, waiting quietly to board a commercial flight back to his homeland, without fanfare, without guards, without the armor of power. That was how he moved through the world. Humble, silent, grounded. He believed that leadership wasn't about towering over people. It was about standing beside them, feeling what they felt, living as they lived. Today, as always, he chose to walk among them unseen. He had just come from Europe, from long, grueling talks behind closed doors, discussions about gold reserves, sovereignty, and the future of a continent that refused to be anyone's pawn. But now, those heavy conversations were behind him. Now, all he wanted was to go home, to breathe the dusty air of Ouagadougou, to feel the red earth under his feet again. He adjusted the strap of his backpack over his shoulder, blending into the hum of the morning crowd. As he walked toward the boarding area for the Air France flight, he offered a warm smile and a soft, "Bonjour, ça va?" to a tired airport worker wheeling a luggage cart. The worker smiled back, oblivious to the quiet gravity of the man before him. That was how Ibrahim preferred it. No flashing cameras, no pomp, no declarations. He moved smoothly, quietly, boarding the plane with the others, offering a polite nod to the flight attendants as he passed. Seat 2A, business class, window seat. He sat down, leaned back, pulled out his phone, and began scrolling with the ease of a man who had learned that real power needs no performance. Around him, nobody batted an eye. Nobody thought twice. Chapucha them. He was just another face in the crowd, another black traveler in a hoodie trying to make it home. And that was exactly how he wanted it, or so he thought. Because a few rows behind him, the storm had already started brewing. Whispers, impatient tapping of expensive shoes, frowns gathering like dark clouds. A French CEO, wealthy, entitled, used to red carpets and reserved treatment, had just been told there were no more seats left in business class. And he wasn't about to take no for an answer. What he, and the world, didn't know yet was that he wasn't just fighting for a seat. He was about to challenge something much bigger. He was about to disrespect a man whose silence carried more weight than 1,000 shouting executives. And once that plane touched the ground, the arrogance of that moment would echo across nations. Stay with me, because what's about to unfold will change everything you thought you knew about power, dignity, and how the quietest man in the room sometimes holds the world in his hands. It began like a ripple on a quiet lake, small, barely noticeable. But soon it would grow into a storm no one could escape. A few rows behind Ibrahim Traoré, the murmurs had already started. An important man, at least in his own mind, had just been told no. A senior French CEO, draped in tailored arrogance and designer impatience, had arrived at the gate expecting the world to bend. But there were no seats left in business class, full, occupied, finished. For most travelers, it would have been a simple inconvenience. For him, it was unthinkable. He wasn't just another passenger. He barked to the bewildered gate agents. He was a strategic partner, a man invested heavily in African infrastructure, a VIP used to first-class champagne, private lounges, and red carpet treatment. He tapped his polished leather shoes against the marble floor, his irritation growing like a pressure cooker about to blow. Assistants scurried around him. Airline staff whispered frantically, checking tablets and terminals. But the truth was simple and stubborn. Business class was full. The Frenchman wasn't used to being told no, and certainly not by people he deemed beneath him. Unwilling to accept the situation, the CEO made a demand. Fix it. Find me a seat. Under mounting pressure, the airline called in their secret weapon, Claire. A tall, statuesque senior flight attendant with sharp eyes and a colder smile, she carried herself like a queen enforcing the rules of her kingdom. If anyone could solve the problem, it was her. Claire strode onto the plane with brisk, deliberate steps, her heels clicking like gunshots on the aisle floor. She scanned the business cabin with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey. Her gaze barely brushed over the European passengers reclining in their seats. Then, her eyes paused, fixed on the man in seat 2A. There he sat, calm, quiet, dressed in a simple hoodie, scrolling through his phone, no Rolex flashing on his wrist. No assistant hovering nearby, no aura of importance, at least not by the metrics Claire had learned to recognize. Just another black man occupying a valuable seat. Probably a mistake, she thought. Without hesitation, she approached him with a tight, practiced smile. "Monsieur, may I see your boarding pass?" Her voice was syrupy, but her body language screamed suspicion. Ibrahim looked up slowly, meeting her gaze with serene politeness. Without a word, he handed her the pass. Claire studied it longer than necessary, her eyes darting between the ticket and the man before her. Row 2A. Correct. Paid. Boarded properly. Everything in order. And yet, something about him didn't sit right with her. Returning the boarding pass, Claire smiled again, but this time it was thinner, colder. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice, "we may need you to relocate to economy class to accommodate another guest. We will, of course, compensate you." The words were dressed in courtesy, but the insult cut clean and deep. Ibrahim's eyebrows lifted slightly. He tilted his head, as if he hadn't quite heard her correctly. "And why me?" he asked, his voice steady, as steel wrapped in silk. "No reason, sir," Claire answered quickly, a tremor just barely concealed under her professional mask. "Just a small adjustment for operational reasons. Nothing personal." "A guest more important than me?" Ibrahim asked. Again, voice still smooth, but laced now with an undeniable weight. Claire hesitated. Other passengers started to glance up from their newspapers and laptops, sensing that something wasn't right. But as so often happens in quiet injustices, no one said a word. Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, calm and immovable. "No," he said, simply. "I will remain in my seat." For a second, Claire froze. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone she had already decided was beneath her. She pasted on another smile, icier this time. "Sir, I must insist. It's for operational reasons," she repeated, her voice harder now. Ibrahim didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away. "Then explain," he said softly. "Why?" I'm being asked, and not anyone else. It was a question she had no answer for. The air inside the cabin shifted. A few passengers fidgeted, awkwardly. One man lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over its rim. A woman's fingers paused mid-typing on her laptop. The tension was thick, vibrating in the walls. But still, no one spoke. No one dared. Claire backed away quickly, flustered, whispering into the intercom phone to the cockpit. When she returned, her mind was made up. If one black man wouldn't move, maybe another would. She began targeting others. A younger African man, maybe late 20s, was next. Claire stopped beside his seat and gestured with a brittle smile. "You—" "Sir, we need you to move to economy," she said, without even attempting the polite tone she had used before. The young man looked up, confused. "Why me?" Claire didn't answer. She just snatched his boarding pass and began processing the downgrade, and that was when Ibrahim stood up. Enough, he didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms or create a scene. He simply rose to his full height, his presence alone commanding the entire cabin's attention. "You are making decisions based on skin, not tickets," he said, voice low but carrying across the business class cabin like a hammer falling. "That's called discrimination." Claire's face flushed crimson. "Sir, please sit down," she hissed, forcing the corners of her mouth into a strained smile. "Please don't cause a scene." but Ibrahim's gaze locked onto her with a calm, chilling steadiness that stole the breath from her lungs. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. His dignity screamed louder than any insult. Passengers now watched openly. No more subtle glances, no more pretending not to notice. Even those who had chosen comfort over conscience were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Still, Claire refused to back down. She retreated to the front of the cabin, whispering furiously to the other crew members. "These people," she muttered under her breath in French, her tone dripping disdain. Always making noise. She didn't know that one of these people was about to shake her entire world to its core. Minutes later, the French CEO finally boarded, escorted with quiet desperation by airline staff eager to please him. Claire transformed instantly, her body language blooming into deference. She smiled warmly, greeted him with champagne, bowed slightly, treating him like royalty. Meanwhile, Ibrahim sat back down in 2A, fastening his seatbelt, his fingers drumming quietly against the armrest. He didn't need to make a scene. He didn't need to reveal anything, because soon the entire world would find out exactly who had just been insulted and how dearly that mistake would cost. And yet, they still didn't know. They had no idea who they had tried to humiliate. But they were about to find out. The French CEO stepped into the cabin like a king returning to his throne. His polished shoes clicked arrogantly against the floor as he made his grand entrance. Claire, the senior flight attendant, practically glowed with reverence as she welcomed him aboard. Champagne was already prepared, chilled to perfection, warm towels ready. She greeted him with a bright smile and a slight dip of her head, the kind of deference she hadn't offered to anyone else, especially not to the quiet man sitting just 2 rows ahead in 2A. "Welcome aboard, monsieur," she said with a little flourish, handing him the glass. "We're fixing the seating issue right now," the CEO chuckled, brushing invisible dust from his custom suit. He barely acknowledged Ibrahim Traoré as he passed him. In his mind, Traoré didn't exist, just another anonymous face in the crowd, easily dismissed, easily moved aside. Meanwhile, Ibrahim remained still. He didn't look up, didn't flinch. He simply tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, his breathing calm, his mind sharper than ever. He had seen it all before, the entitlement, the quiet, cruel ways that power was often misused. Yet still, he chose to sit silently, to watch, to wait. The plane pushed away from the gate, rumbling forward with heavy purpose. Engines roared to life. The cabin vibrated gently as the aircraft began to ascend into the cold French morning, carrying with it not just its passengers, but an invisible tension no one could yet name. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Claire moved through the aisles, fussing over the CEO like he was royalty. She adjusted his seat personally, topped off his champagne with delicate precision. She even laughed at his jokes, loud, brittle laughter that floated down the aisles, desperate to be heard. When she finally reached Ibrahim's row, her smile faded into something more mechanical, more obligatory. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice flat. Ibrahim glanced up briefly. "Water is fine," he said, tone polite but unmistakably distant. She nodded curtly and disappeared, returning moments later with a plastic cup, filled hastily, no pleasantries offered, no second glance, no ceremony. Meanwhile, the CEO sipped from his crystal glass, lounging like a man inspecting his domain. He leaned back, smirking, and struck up a conversation with a fellow French businessman seated nearby. Their voices weren't loud, but in the hush of the cabin, every word carried. "Africa is lucky to have us," the CEO said casually, swirling his champagne like a trophy. "Without us, there would be nothing but chaos." Claire, standing nearby, nodded eagerly. "Absolutely," she said. "Order needs to be maintained. They don't know how to manage, well, anything." Ibrahim heard every word. He didn't react, not outwardly, not a flicker of anger. Just the same calm stillness, the same quiet dignity that had carried him through rooms full of presidents, generals, and billionaires who had underestimated him before. He knew the type. He had heard these sentiments whispered in polished boardrooms and golden palaces. They always thought They were saving Africa, when in truth they were draining it dry. But Ibrahim stayed silent. He was a man playing a long game. Across the aisle, a woman watched him carefully. An African nurse, returning home to Bobo Dioulasso after years working abroad. She recognized him almost immediately, the quiet strength in his posture, the calm in his eyes. She leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, voice low, reverent. "That's our president," she said. "That's Ibrahim Traoré. They don't even know who they're humiliating," the seatmate gasped softly, clutching their seat arm. But neither dared to say a word. Ibrahim clearly didn't want attention. And so, like shadows, they kept his secret, watching with heavy hearts as the small injustices played out. Hours passed. The lights dimmed, casting the cabin into a soft blue glow. Most passengers drifted into uneasy sleep. Even the CEO, after 3 glasses of champagne, began to snore gently, his mouth slack, his arrogance temporarily silenced. But Ibrahim Traoré stayed awake. He stared out of the window into the endless darkness, the ocean of clouds below. His mind wasn't on revenge or anger, it was on the future, the heavy weight of leadership, the quiet, patient work of rebuilding a broken system from the inside out. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience changes history. As the flight continued, subtle changes unfolded. Claire stopped making eye contact with Ibrahim altogether. She couldn't explain it, but something about him unsettled her. There was an authority in his silence she couldn't place, a power that needed no words. She busied herself with trivial tasks, adjusting blankets, refilling drinks, doing everything she could to avoid the man she had tried to displace. The aircraft began its slow descent hours later. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Ouagadougou in French and English. Passengers stirred, stretching stiff limbs, buckling seatbelts. Cabin lights flickered back to life, revealing faces groggy but expectant. Outside the windows, the African sunrise blazed gold and crimson over the red soil, painting the land with the fire of a new day. But something else was happening too, something none of the passengers could see yet. Lining the tarmac below were rows of black SUVs, presidential escorts, and heavily armed soldiers standing at crisp attention. A convoy fit not for a visiting executive, but for a head of state. Inside the cabin, whispers began to spread, carried on nervous breaths. "Are we landing into a war zone?" a foreigner muttered, glancing out the window at the military presence. No, another replied. "Probably just protocol. Maybe someone important is arriving." The CEO chuckled under his breath, smug and self-satisfied. "Must be for me," he whispered to Claire, adjusting his cufflinks with exaggerated flair. Claire laughed along with him, her voice a brittle tinkle. "Of course, monsieur, it would only make sense." She even began planning the grand exit in her mind, how she would personally escort him off the plane ahead of the other passengers. She imagined the cameras flashing, the dignitaries shaking his hand, the adulation she could bask in by association. Neither of them suspected the truth. Neither of them knew they had mistaken proximity to real power for ownership of it. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling to a slow, controlled stop on the shimmering tarmac. Engines hummed down to silence. The CEO stood first, smoothing his jacket, flashing a blinding white smile toward Claire. She moved toward the front, clipboard in hand, ready to clear his way. Out the windows, soldiers lined up in rows so precise they seemed carved from stone. Behind them, ministers, defense, foreign affairs, security, all stood sweating in the sun, unmoving, statues of loyalty and strength. Claire peeked out the window again and gasped. "What is this?" she whispered under her breath, her stomach knotting. With confusion she couldn't name. The CEO grinned wider. "Clearly," he said, "they rolled out the red carpet for someone important." He patted Claire's shoulder patronizingly, as if inviting her to share in his presumed glory. But in seat 2A, Ibrahim Traoré remained calm. His hands folded lightly in his lap, his gaze steady. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. His crown was invisible, But the ones who truly knew, those who carried hope in their hearts and fire in their veins, they had always seen it. And the time was coming when everyone else would see it too. The wheels of the plane kissed the tarmac with a soft, decisive thud. A ripple ran through the cabin as passengers straightened their backs, gathering their belongings, eager to disembark. Beyond the small oval windows, the real show was just beginning. Rows upon rows of black SUVs gleamed under the burning Burkina Faso sun. Elite soldiers, clad in crisp uniforms and armed with rifles, lined up in perfect symmetry along the runway. Behind them, the country's top ministers stood tall, their suits dark against the golden landscape. Defense, foreign affairs, national security. The faces of a government assembled in full force. It was a reception fit for royalty or revolution. Inside the cabin, passengers craned their necks, murmuring with nervous awe. Foreign visitors whispered theories. Maybe a celebrity? A visiting president? Some high-profile official? The French CEO, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored jacket, smirked knowingly. In his mind, there was no question. This spectacle was clearly for him. His investments, his projects, his influence, they mattered. Of course, Burkina Faso would honor him. It was only natural. Claire hovered beside him, practically buzzing with self-importance, clipboard in hand, ready to whisk him off the plane ahead of everyone else. She smoothed her uniform, checked her hair in a reflection, and smiled. Neither of them spared even a passing glance at the quiet man sitting in 2A. They never did. A moment passed. The cabin door cracked open with a hiss. Cool air rushed in. And then, a silence thicker than the midday heat descended. Boots echoed on the floor, heavy, deliberate. A tall officer in a black beret, medals glinting on his chest, stepped onto the plane. His presence shifted the very air in the cabin. He wasn't here to play games. He moved with slow authority, scanning each face, each row, ignoring the CEO's smug, expectant smile. The officer walked past the first row, past the business elite, past the fidgeting dignitaries and foreigners. He stopped at 2A. The cabin seemed to freeze. The officer straightened his back, raised his hand to his forehead, and delivered a crisp, perfect military salute. "Monsieur le Président," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Welcome home." For a moment, no one breathed. You could feel the collective realization ripple through the plane like an electric shock. Claire's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. The CEO's confident grin faltered, cracking into a confused, horrified grimace. Ibrahim Traoré slowly rose from his seat, composed, serene. He nodded once, acknowledging the salute without a word. His every movement radiated power, not the kind bought with money, but the kind forged in patience, sacrifice, and the love of a people. The CEO stumbled back, mouth opening and closing, soundlessly like a drowning man gasping for air. "President?" he stuttered, voice barely above a whisper. Traoré turned slightly, meeting the CEO's eyes with a calm so absolute it was terrifying. Not angry, not smug, just undeniable. Before anyone could react, another officer stepped aboard, followed by two more. Their faces were hard, their steps methodical. "You two," the lead officer barked, pointing directly at Claire and the CEO, "will come with us immediately." "What?" Claire shrieked, panic exploding across her face. "Why me?" "You are being detained for questioning," the officer said coldly. "You have publicly disrespected the head of state on national soil. That is a serious offense." The CEO spluttered, reaching instinctively for his phone, for his connections, for his imagined immunity. None of it mattered now. Claire laughed nervously, eyes darting around the cabin for support that would never come. No, she stammered. "This has to be a mistake. I was just doing my job." No one listened. Another officer produced a pair of handcuffs with a metallic snap. Claire and the CEO were both cuffed, their wrists bound tightly, their dignity stripped bare. Around them, passengers sat frozen in their seats, watching with wide, disbelieving eyes. The same people who had turned away earlier, who had avoided eye contact when injustice first crept into the cabin. now stared openly at the consequences unfolding before them. Their shame hung heavy in the air. Slowly, Ibrahim Traoré moved toward the exit, his posture regal, untouched by the chaos behind him. As he stepped out of the plane, the sun caught him full in the face. His people awaited him below, guards, ministers, civilians, all standing, in unwavering attention. The moment his feet touched the ground, a cheer erupted beyond the barriers, where crowds had gathered. Cameras clicked and flashed. Cries of, "Welcome home, Mr. President," filled the air. This wasn't just a homecoming. It was history. Behind him, Claire and the CEO were dragged down the steps, their faces contorted in disbelief and terror. Gone were their smug smiles, their airs of superiority. In their place, panic, humiliation, and a crushing realization that no title, no fortune, no entitlement could shield them now. The tarmac blazed under the unforgiving sun, but all eyes remained, fixed on the two disgraced figures being escorted away in silence. No one shouted, no one jeered. The silence was louder than any condemnation, a silence that screamed, "We see you now." The convoy of black SUVs roared to life. Claire and the CEO were shoved into separate vehicles, surrounded by armed guards. The vehicles pulled away, leaving behind nothing but dust and shattered pride. Inside the terminal, President Traoré stood before a small gathering of press and dignitaries. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, unshakable. "In Burkina Faso," he said, "we do not measure a man's worth by the color of his skin, nor do we bow to foreign money or old colonial habits. Here, we honor dignity, humanity, respect for our people. That is the new Africa." The words hit like a hammer. Within hours, footage of the confrontation exploded across social media. Videos leaked, photos of Traoré receiving a military salute, while Claire and the CEO were marched off in handcuffs, flooded every corner of the internet. Respect Africa. Is stand with Burkina, new Africa. They trended globally. Young Africans from Dakar to Nairobi to Johannesburg filled the streets with celebrations. Memes, art, songs, all celebrating the moment a quiet man in a hoodie reminded the world that real power speaks through actions, not appearances. At the Ministry of Justice, formal charges were filed. Claire and the CEO faced accusations of public insult and discrimination against a head of state, violation of national dignity, and abuse of power. The French embassy tried desperately to intervene, placing frantic calls, issuing diplomatic protests. But Traoré's response was clear. "This is not a colony," he declared from the presidential palace. "This is a sovereign nation. Justice here will be equal for all." Air France scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing a hollow public apology within 24 hours. An empty statement filled with corporate jargon and sanitized regret. But it was too late. Boycotts ignited across Africa. Celebrities, activists, and politicians from around the world weighed in. Claire, sitting alone in a detention cell outside Ouagadougou, broke down during questioning. "I didn't know who he was," she sobbed. "I was just following procedures." The investigator's reply was cold and merciless. "You didn't need to know who he was. You only needed to treat him like a human being." The CEO tried to leverage his influence to escape justice, reaching out to connections both in Burkina Faso and abroad. But the courts ruled swiftly: no immunity, no special treatment, no exceptions. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré returned quietly to work. He didn't boast, he didn't gloat. He simply continued the long, difficult task of rebuilding his nation, strengthening the military, empowering the youth, investing in roads, schools, and healthcare. But the memory of that flight, the flight where a man in a hoodie reminded the world that dignity needs no crown, became legend. And yet, as the dust settled, one truth became clear. This was only the beginning. The old powers had been shaken. But the real storm, the battle for Africa's future, was just about to begin. Stay tuned. Long after the plane had emptied, after the handcuffs had clicked shut, after the world had watched in stunned disbelief, one image remained burned into history. A man in a simple hoodie, stepping quietly onto the tarmac of his homeland, greeted, not by fanfare, but by the unwavering respect of his people. Ibrahim Traoré didn't need a golden crown or an entourage of bodyguards to command authority. His crown was invisible, woven from dignity, humility, and an unshakable strength that could not be bought or borrowed. In a world obsessed with appearances, flashy suits, loud voices, grandstanding, he reminded everyone that true power often moves in silence, acts with patience, and speaks only when the moment demands. Across Africa, a ripple became a wave. Young people whispered to each other in universities, marketplaces, and dusty village squares, "If he can do it, so can we." His quiet defiance became a beacon, a reminder that the old games of power, racism, and entitlement could be challenged and beaten, not with rage, but with resilience. Claire's downfall and the CEO's public humiliation echoed far beyond that runway. They became symbols of a crumbling arrogance, the end of a certain kind of thinking, that wealth grants superiority, that skin color defines worth. Their fall was not just a personal disgrace, it was a global warning shot. Prejudice. Cloaked in professionalism would no longer go unnoticed, nor unpunished. Social media erupted. Footage of Traoré's return and the arrests of Claire and the CEO flooded timelines across continents. Boycotts were organized, airlines scrambled, corporations issued rushed apologies. Hashtags like Joch Respect Africa and New Africa Rising dominated trends for days. Solidarity bloomed, not just among Africans, but among all who had longed to see dignity reclaim its place over dominance. Yet while the world buzzed with outrage and celebration, Ibrahim Traoré returned to what he had always cared about most, his people. There were no interviews seeking revenge, no boastful declarations, no vendettas. He simply rolled up his sleeves and continued the real work, rebuilding roads, strengthening education, fortifying national defense, and, most importantly, restoring pride in a nation long underestimated. He understood something many leaders never do. History is not written by those who shout the loudest. It's written by those who endure the longest. For every insult quietly endured, for every judgment passed without a word, Traoré had built a reservoir of strength. And now, that strength wasn't just his own. It belonged to an entire generation. Rising behind him, in a world so often dazzled by glitter and noise, maybe, just maybe, real power still travels quietly. Maybe the ones who truly change history don't announce themselves with trumpets, but with the sound of steady footsteps on familiar soil, returning home. But the story of Ibrahim Traoré didn't end at that airport. No, that moment was merely the beginning. The old powers had felt the first tremor, but a greater battle was coming, one that would move beyond runways and press conferences and into the very soul of global politics. The world hadn't seen the last of him. Stay tuned for Part 2, where the fight for Africa's dignity moves to the world stage. Don't miss it.